Get her off my stage. She's blind. She'll damage the Steinway. That was all it took. A public insult from a famous pianist, and the world nearly lost a miracle. Livia Jackson, a blind black girl, humiliated in front of a crowd, said nothing in response. She simply sat at the piano, and when her fingers touched the keys, the world held its breath. What followed wasn't just music. It was a movement. This is the unforgettable story of how a girl without sight, without fame, and without a stage gave humanity something it had forgotten how to do. Listen now. Before we dive deeper, subscribe to our channel. We share powerful, meaningful stories like this every day, and leave a comment below to let us know where you're watching from. Thank you so much. Now let's return to the story. Keep her away from the Steinway. This isn't a charity recital. The voice cut through the auditorium like a whip, arrogant and sharp, slicing through the soft murmur of pre-show conversations. Gasps echoed through the room as heads turned. At the center of it all, under the intense glow of a crystal chandelier, a girl stood motionless. She held a white cane lightly in one hand, while the other hovered inches from the polished black surface of a grand piano. She didn't flinch. She didn't speak, but something in the firmness of her delicate yet resolute jaw refused to yield. The man who spoke, dressed in an impeccably tailored black suit, stepped forward. Vincent Harris, a name etched in the history of classical music, the kind of artist who could silence rooms with the touch of a single key. His gray hair and icy blue eyes radiated authority. People bowed when he entered places like this. His hands were revered by millions. And now those same hands pointed with disdain at the girl before him. She doesn't belong at that bench, he said, half to the stage manager, half to the dozens of elite guests already seated. She's blind, for God's sake. She'll damage the piano. Sir, came a hesitant voice from behind the curtain. She only asked to touch the keys. She's not even scheduled to perform. I don't care, Vincent snapped. You don't let a child play in traffic just because she wants to drive. Get her off my stage. Livia still hadn't moved. Her eyes, opaque with clouded pupils, seemed fixed on some point beyond the piano. She looked younger than she was, maybe 14 or 15. But something in her presence defied fragility. Though her frame was small and slender, her hands were elegant and long, hands born to create sound. I'm sorry, she said softly. Her voice floated across the stage like a leaf on still water. I didn't mean to interrupt. No need to make a scene, Vincent replied coldly, already turning away. The world has enough sad stories. Backstage, someone was recording. An off-duty security guard, his phone half-tucked in his coat pocket. He hadn't meant to film, not really, but something in Livia's stillness made his thumb press record almost instinctively. She stepped back, positioning her cane in front of her again. There was no tremble in her hands, no moisture in her eyes. The silence in the room grew heavier, not a respectful silence, but the sticky quiet that follows public cruelty. People shifted in their seats. Someone coughed. A few whispered. Then, she turned and walked away. No one knew her name. Not yet. 2 years earlier, Livia Jackson was just another invisible figure in the marble hallways of the Brookhaven Conservatory in Chicago, the kind of place where students' last names mattered more than their talents. Most students came from wealthy families, children of ambassadors, retired ballet legends, global conductors. Livia had nothing. No mother, no father, just a social worker who dropped her off at the campus gate with a battered suitcase full of worn clothes, a dead metronome, and a half-broken Braille reader. The conservatory didn't truly admit her. She was there under a program called Silent Observer, a polite term for keeping her away from stages and classrooms while allowing her to soak up inspiration. And soak it up she did. From outside rehearsal rooms through cracked doors, from the vibrations in the floorboards when pianists practiced upstairs. She spent her afternoons cross-legged in the hallway outside Professor Edward Thompson's classroom, tracing music in the air with her fingers, every muscle in her hands pulsing with invisible strings. It was Edward who noticed first. At first, he thought it was a coincidence. But one night, as rain pounded so hard on the conservatory's arched glass roof that even rehearsals became impossible, he saw her there, seated, hands suspended in the air, eyes closed, following a silent rhythm. He crouched down. "Are you mimicking my class?" Edward Thompson asked. "I was trying to," Livia replied, hesitant. "I'm sorry." "For what?" he asked. She paused. "For being here." Edward blinked. The hallway smelled of ancient stone and varnished wood. Thunder roared outside. "Don't apologize. Be precise," he said. From that day on, when the students left and the lights dimmed, Edward stayed behind. He taught her not with printed sheet music but with stories, describing how a fugue should feel like chasing your own shadow, or how Debussy was like water tumbling down a hill, unpredictable, fluid, free. He pressed her fingers against the wood to explain the weight of a chord, tapped syncopated rhythms on her knuckles, hummed scales in her ear until she could sense the tonality without hearing it. Livia absorbed it all at a startling speed. But talent at a place like Brookhaven Conservatory wasn't enough. Many students avoided her, some because of her blindness, others because of her black skin. Once, a classmate whispered loudly enough to be heard, "She's only here because of a quota, right?" Livia heard but didn't respond. When the conservatory announced its showcase for young virtuosos, Edward filled out her application. He didn't mention her disability. He listed her name, her skill, and a recommendation so fervent it bordered on a prayer. She was allowed to audition. Technically, her slot was at 7:45 a.m., before most professors arrived. The piano they gave her was an old baby grand, slightly out of tune, in the East rehearsal wing, not the concert Steinway. A single judge showed up to hear her. No audience, no welcome. Livia sat in silence for a long time before positioning her fingers on the keys. When she began to play, she didn't just perform music. She summoned it, transformed it. The piece, Rachmaninoff's Prelude in G minor, rose from the piano like something alive, immense, painful, and achingly tender. When she finished, the judge nodded curtly and left without a word. She never got a call back, and Livia vanished from the conservatory's hallways. What she didn't know, what no one told her, was that someone had been watching. The janitor, who cleaned the wing every morning, had paused outside the door. He heard what the judge heard, but unlike the judge, he was moved. That night, he uploaded the video he'd discreetly recorded, titling it, "Blind Black Girl Rejected by Conservatory Plays Rachmaninoff by Heart." The video didn't go viral right away, but days later, a piano blogger in Berlin reposted it. Then a music therapist in Argentina, and a retired guitarist in Brooklyn. Views tripled every hour. Comments poured in from every continent. "She plays like she's telling her own story," one wrote. "I felt it in my chest." The conservatory's board panicked. Not publicly, but in closed-door meetings, heated arguments erupted. A nervous administrator asked if they could track her IP address. Another pointed out she didn't even have an IP address. She didn't own a phone. She was unreachable, until she wasn't. An envelope arrived at the conservatory's front desk. Hand-delivered, with gilded edges, from the International Gala of Human Harmony, a global concert broadcast to over 60 countries. This year's theme, Breaking Barriers Through Sound. They wanted Livia Jackson to open the show. The director choked on his coffee. It wasn't a request, it was a declaration. A spotlight had been lit, and for the first time, Livia was no longer a shadow hidden in the back hallway. She would share the stage with Vincent Harris himself. And Vincent didn't take the news well. She'll ruin the program's integrity. His voice was low, calm, almost pleasant, too calm, like winter wind that quiets before it bites. He was speaking to the gala's director, an elderly man named Gerard Moreau, whose career spanned every corner of global musical diplomacy. They stood near the stage's edge during a pre-rehearsal visit at the Grand Hall of Harmony in Vienna. "She's a child, blind, untrained. It's political." "You know it is." Gerard raised an eyebrow. His French-accented voice carried just enough steel to remind Vincent he wasn't speaking to a sycophant. "And yet, the world is waiting to hear her. Or haven't you seen the numbers?" Vincent exhaled, slow and sharp. "This isn't a talent show." "No," Gerard replied, with a faint smile. "It's a reckoning." In another corner of the city, Livia Jackson stood barefoot in the stillness of her hotel suite. The floor beneath her feet was cold marble, veined like the branches of a river frozen in time. She tilted her head slightly, listening to the wind against the window, then the silence between gusts. Even in unfamiliar cities, she mapped the world by sound, the low rumble of distant traffic, the high hiss of a faulty elevator 2 floors up, the irregular tap of a branch against the glass. It all fit together like an unwritten score. Professor Edward had flown with her, despite no longer holding an official title. He refused to leave her, even when the conservatory tried to replace him with a flashy manager. "You know," he whispered during the flight, "in all my years I never imagined I'd be traveling the world with the best pianist I've ever taught, and one the school never admitted." Livia smiled softly. "They admitted my footsteps. That's something." He laughed. "You've always played with a quiet kind of defiance." The rehearsal was scheduled for the following afternoon. Livia Jackson hadn't touched a piano since the day she walked off that stage. Not out of fear, but because something within her had shifted. Playing used to be her escape, her way of turning the world into melody when life refused to be kind. But now the world wanted to listen, not as background noise, not as indulgence, but as truth. And the weight of that was immense. Still, when the moment came, when the rehearsal hall doors opened and the spotlight descended from the rafters like a blade of light, she didn't hesitate. She walked calmly, Edward at her side, until her fingers brushed the edge of the piano bench. It was the model she'd always dreamed of, a concert Steinway D. Its finish was cold, smooth, untouched. Her fingers trembled for a moment, then stilled, and she sat. Every sound in the hall retreated. Even the dust seemed to pause. She placed her hands on the keys but didn't play. She held the silence in her palms, stretching it, commanding it until it bowed to her. Then, with a breath so soft it barely belonged to her, she began. The notes that echoed didn't come from any known sonata or concerto. They followed no familiar pattern. No famous composer had written them centuries ago. They were hers, raw, without sheet music, born in that exact moment. A blend of memory and invention. She started with a sustained G, soft, uncertain, like a child groping in a dark room. Then, a cascade of trills in her right hand, followed by a progression of broken chords that sounded like sunlight filtered through pain. Her left hand moved slowly, deliberately, more felt than heard. Those present, technicians, assistants, even the man fixing a cable in the ceiling, froze. No one signaled. No one dared interrupt. Even Vincent, standing near the wings, stopped mid-sentence when the music began. He didn't move. His eyes narrowed. There was something haunting in it, something unsettling. "She's not reading anything," he thought. "Not even muscle memory. This is pure creation. No one plays like this without being broken first." And then he realized. She wasn't broken. He was. The melody shifted. A sudden turn. Minor chords now, melancholic notes, rising in wounded defiance. Her body leaned slightly forward, as if pulled by invisible threads. Her face was serene, not joyful, not anguished, just open, like a door cracked during a storm. Then, without warning, she stopped mid-chord. Her hands hovered. No resolution, no applause, just silence. and that silence thundered through the hall like the aftermath of a war. The rehearsal director stepped forward, stunned. "Miss Jackson, will that be your piece for the gala?" She tilted her head, considering. "No," she said. "That was just a warm-up." Vincent clenched his jaw. The next day, the gala director received a request from Vincent Harris's agent. He wanted to change the performance order. Vincent no longer wished to play after Livia. He wanted to open the show. The request was denied. Meanwhile, news of Livia's rehearsal leaked. Someone had recorded a 45-second audio clip on their phone and posted it to a classical music forum. The clip was shared over 3 million times in 12 hours. Headlines followed. "The blind virtuoso who reads no scores, the girl who silenced an auditorium, Rachmaninoff reincarnated." "No. Jackson begins." Vincent spent the night pacing, restless. Not exactly out of jealousy, but fear. Not of her, but of something deeper, irrelevance, of watching his legacy eclipsed not by time, but by a girl who played with a purity he hadn't touched in decades. He hadn't played with truth in so long he'd forgotten what it sounded like. Now all he had was perfection. She had something more. On the morning of the gala, the grand hall of harmony buzzed like a hive of silk and diamonds. Diplomats, royalty, philanthropists, critics, and composers filled every velvet seat. The orchestra tuned under golden arches. Cameras were ready. Backstage, Vincent warmed up alone. His fingers danced across the keys with rehearsed brilliance. Every note precise, every tempo obeyed. He didn't know that in a room nearby, Livia sat with her hands in her lap, doing nothing but breathing, listening, mapping the auditorium's resonance by its pulse. Feeling the floor's vibrations as the audience entered. She didn't need sight. She could feel the weight of thousands. Professor Edwards stood beside her, holding her cane. "Are you scared?" he whispered. She shook her head gently. "No," Livia said. "I've already played my hardest music. This is just the truth." Edwards smiled. "Then give it to them." She nodded and stood. An assistant parted the side curtain. It was time. "Ladies and gentlemen," the presenter's voice echoed through the opulent auditorium. "Please welcome to the stage, Livia Jackson." A wave of curiosity rippled through the audience. Some leaned forward, eyebrows raised. Others turned to their programs, flipping pages for the unfamiliar name. A few whispered to their neighbors. Most had never heard of her. Those who had seen the viral video weeks earlier sat motionless, anticipation pulsing beneath their skin like a breath that couldn't be released. The house lights dimmed. A single beam of golden light descended from the rafters, illuminating the grand Steinway that loomed like a beast of sound, waiting to be awakened. And then she appeared. No dramatic entrance, no fanfare, no flowing gown, just Livia. Barefoot, in a simple black dress, one hand resting lightly on Professor Edwards' arm, the other loosely holding her white cane. The audience watched in reverent silence as she approached the piano. Her steps were slow, deliberate, but without a trace of fear. Her head tilted slightly as she counted the spaces. Edward guided her gently to the bench, then stepped back into the shadows, like a guardian who had fulfilled his purpose. Livia sat for a moment. She didn't move. Her hands rested in her lap, and her head bowed, not in submission, but in communion, like a priestess before an altar or a soldier before a storm. The silence became sacred. And then, almost inaudibly, she inhaled. Her fingers rose, hovered, and began to play. But what came wasn't a recognizable prelude. Not Chopin, not Beethoven, not Bach. No one in the audience could name it, because it had no name. It was something else. Something older than sheet music, deeper than memory. It was a story. Her right hand danced in ripples across the high register. Delicate notes that skipped like raindrops sliding down glass. They were playful, hesitant, childlike. Her left hand joined a moment later, slow and rich, anchoring the melody with the weight of an absent father, a mother's voice lost to time. Those in the audience who knew hardship felt it instantly, the trembling start, the notes stumbling, searching, then finding clarity all at once. An ascending scale that soared briefly in triumph, only to collapse again into minor tones that sounded like unanswered prayers. It wasn't a performance, it was memory. A sigh broke the air in the front row. An ambassador's wife dabbed her cheek with the edge of her glove. A young violinist in the balcony leaned so far forward that his glasses slipped off his face and clinked on the floor below. But no one hushed him. No one moved, because now Livia's time had shifted. The chords thickened. Her fingers struck the keys with unexpected force. Percussive bursts that thundered like fists pounding a locked door. Her whole body moved with the sound. Shoulders tense, spine curved. The rhythm turned defiant, angry, alive. This was no longer just memory. It was resistance. The music seemed to shout, "You never gave me a chance. You ignored me. You shut your doors, but I'm still here." Each crescendo hit like a confession. Each diminuendo left a void, pulling the crowd closer. Even Vincent, watching from the dressing room on a live monitor, froze mid-step. He had one hand on the tuning keys of his own piano but didn't touch them now. His mouth was slightly open, eyes narrowed. She had no score, no orchestra, no conductor, yet she commanded every soul in the room like a maestro. Halfway through the piece, Livia slowed. Her left hand stopped entirely, and with her right she began a single melody, a simple, nostalgic sequence in E major. It climbed, as if reaching for the stars. She repeated it once, twice, then altered it slightly. One note bent downward, another was skipped, and suddenly those listening understood. It was her mother's lullaby. Untrained ears wouldn't catch it. But those with childhoods filled with soft songs, with cradles rocked under moonlight, recognized it instantly, and it shattered them. The notes faded. The hall was utterly silent. Livia held the final chord so lightly it was almost a breath, then released it into nothingness. No movement, no bow. She sat, hands on her knees, facing the audience she couldn't see but knowing exactly what she'd left in their hearts. And then came the thunder. Applause erupted like a dam breaking. It wasn't polite. It was primal. Chairs scraped back. Some stood, others shouted. There were tears in places that hadn't known crying for decades. The ovation rolled like a wave, sweeping the room in a fervor of awe and disbelief. Cameras panned from face to face. Critics, conductors, heads of state, each with expressions torn open by emotion. A voice shouted from the balcony, "Encore!" Another followed. "Livia! Livia!" She didn't stand. She didn't react. She only turned her face upward, toward the lights, as if hearing the sound not with her ears but with her skin. Backstage, Vincent turned from the monitor and poured himself a drink with trembling hands. "They won't remember me tonight," he murmured. "They'll remember her." He wasn't wrong. In the hours that followed, the gala's live broadcast shattered viewership records. News outlets scrambled for a name. Social media exploded with clips, comments, tributes. Composers posted reaction videos. Critics rushed out emergency editorials calling Livia's performance a once-in-a-century expression of the human spirit. By morning, Livia Jackson was the top search in over 20 countries, and she had no idea. In her quiet hotel room, far from the glow of fame, Livia sat cross-legged on the carpet, hands resting in her lap. Professor Edward sat across from her, his teacup untouched. "Was it enough?" she asked softly. He leaned forward, his voice low and reverent. "You didn't just play music, Livia. You changed its shape." She tilted her head. But I didn't finish the story." He smiled. "No, because now the world will ask for more." "Livia Jackson?" The voice was nervous, breathless, as the man hurried down the marble hallway toward her. She had just slipped out the auditorium's side door, the last echoes of applause still faintly reverberating in the air behind her. Her cane tapped softly against the floor as she paused, turning her head slightly. Edward, ever at her side, stepped forward instinctively to shield her, but the man stopped a few feet away, respectfully. "My name's Anthony Lewis," he said. "I'm with Harmony Records. We just saw your performance, and I don't even have words." Livia nodded slowly. She heard his heart pulsing in his throat, fast, honest, unrehearsed. "I don't know what your situation is with management," he stammered, "but we'd like to discuss a contract. A global tour. Exclusive rights to produce your first studio album. Anything you want. Just name it." Livia said nothing. Her fingers silently twisted the silk fringe at the tip of her cane. The wind moved gently through the corridor's stained glass windows. Edward raised a hand gently. "She'll speak when she's ready." And she did. But it wasn't the answer expected. "Do you know what the word prelude means?" she asked softly. Anthony blinked. It means, well, the beginning, right? It means an introduction to something bigger, something that hasn't happened yet." She turned her head back toward the echoing auditorium behind them. Tonight wasn't the story. It was just a prelude. The man froze, his business cards slipping slightly in his hand, forgotten. By the next morning, a flood of other offers arrived. Every label, every symphony. Private invitations from cultural ministries, royal patrons, directors of major conservatories. Some offered money, others offered entire stages named in her honor. And still, Livia responded to none. She sat with Professor Edward on a train to Asheville, where a quiet retreat awaited. She requested a cabin with no screens, no soundproofing, just windows that opened so she could hear the wind and the countryside passing by. As the landscape slid past, she pressed her palm against the glass and whispered, "They want me to play music I haven't lived yet." Edward smiled faintly. "You've always played from your scars, but maybe now it's time to play from your healing." Back at Brookhaven Conservatory, Vincent Harris lingered. He hadn't spoken publicly since the gala. His agent released a carefully worded statement about artistic reflection and respect for new voices in the music world. But behind closed doors, Vincent sat in the master class wing, watching replays of Livia's performance on an old analog monitor, the digital buffer removed so he could rewind by touch. He didn't speak as he watched. He just listened, over and over. And each time, a different note cut deeper. Because there were things Livia played that he once understood. Before fame, before pressure, before perfection, before every note had to be flawless and every smile timed for the curtains, he'd forgotten how to bleed into the keys. Livia hadn't. She never had a choice. The conservatory scrambled to rewrite its policies. Donations poured in with conditions: create accessible programs, hold blind auditions, fund scholarships for non-traditional students. What had been a hidden rot in its culture was now an open wound, bleeding in public. And Livia remained silent. Weeks passed. The offers kept coming. One morning, Edward found her at a small upright piano in a village cafe near her Asheville retreat, playing for no one in particular. A child sat cross-legged nearby, tracing the floor tiles with a toy car. An old man read the newspaper, unaware of who she was. She played anyway, not for applause, not for contracts, but for the story. A reporter found her eventually. Young, persistent, respectful. He asked if he could record a short segment for a documentary. She hesitated but agreed. "Only if you filmed the piano, not my face. I don't want this to be about me," Livia said. "I want people to hear themselves in the music." "But your story matters," the reporter insisted. "You broke barriers." Livia smiled gently. "No, I just reminded people that silence doesn't mean absence." That clip alone reached 10 million views. Among those who saw it was a deaf teenager from rural Texas, who'd always been told music wasn't for her. After watching Livia, she began experimenting with haptic sound gloves, mapping rhythm through touch. She sent Livia a letter written in Braille with her sister's help. It ended with, "You made room for me." Livia held the letter for a long time. Then, for the first time since the gala, she sat down to compose again. The new piece came to her not as a storm but as a whisper. It began with a simple phrase, 3 notes, no more, repeated with slight variations. She built around it slowly, weaving intervals like vines climbing a trellis. This time, it wasn't sad, angry, or desperate. It was grateful. When she played it for Edward, he closed his eyes halfway through and turned his face, not to hide tears but to honor the moment. "You wrote a bridge," he said softly when she finished. She seemed confused. "A bridge between who you were and who you've become." She titled the piece Sightlines. It was first performed in a modest chamber hall in Seattle, unannounced, a quiet performance for 100 guests. No live stream, no press, just sound. And those lucky enough to be there never forgot it. They said it was like finding a path in the dark and realizing you'd always known the way. "Miss Jackson, did you know you've just been nominated for the Artisan Award?" The voice on the phone trembled with excitement, as if it had been waiting hours for this moment. Livia was sitting in a corner of a sunlit garden in Boston. Her cane rested in her lap like a sleeping bird. Bees danced lazily among the lavender. The breeze stirred the hem of her dress, as if it, too, wanted her attention. She didn't respond right away. The word award always felt strange to her, as if it belonged to other people. People with medals in display cases, framed diplomas, or families who saved front-row seats at their recitals. "I never competed," she said gently. "Not really." "It's not a competition," the voice replied. "It's recognition." Livia tilted her head, listening to the distant church bells mark the hour. Her fingers traced the braille markings of a notebook beside her, a collection of unfinished melodies scattered like rain. Her response came not as a statement but as a murmur. "Then let the music speak. It's all I ever wanted." News of the nomination made headlines within hours. The Artisan Award, given only once a decade to a musician whose work profoundly reshaped humanity's understanding of sound, had never been offered to someone so young, nor to someone blind, nor to someone who never formally graduated from a conservatory. But none of that mattered anymore, because the world was already beginning to shift in her echo. Children in forgotten neighborhoods received keyboards from volunteers instead of toy guns. Entire orchestras revised their audition processes. Requests for braille sheet music surged globally. Music schools, once cold to difference, now raced to embrace it. She never asked for this. She never wanted to be a symbol, but she was becoming one anyway. Meanwhile, in Chicago, the hallways of Brookhaven Conservatory, once humming with silent judgments, now carried a different tone. Professor Edward had returned, not as a lecturer, but as the newly appointed director of inclusive curriculum. It was a role no one could have imagined a year earlier, one the board was practically forced to create after alumni and donors withdrew support. But Edward didn't care how it came about. He cared only that the door, once slammed in Livia's face, was now open for others like her. On his new office door, a simple plaque. "To the students who listen in silence, we hear you now." And Vincent, he lingered long after others moved on. He performed less, traveled even less. But something in him had shifted, quiet and gradual, like ice melting beneath spring soil. He began composing again, not for audiences, but for himself, not grand, flawless symphonies, but raw, intimate pieces, sometimes just a few minutes long. And they all started the same way, with silence. Then a single note, as she had taught him. One morning, Vincent surprised the faculty by asking to sit in on a class. Not to teach, but to learn. He sat in the back row of a beginner's improvisation course, surrounded by students 3 generations younger, scribbling rhythms in a worn notebook. "I never learned to feel my way through music," he admitted to the class one day. Only how to master it. But I met someone who listens better than I ever did. The students listened, and in them, he heard something he hadn't heard in years. Grace. Half a world away, Livia stood on the shore of a quiet bay in Maine, where the waves whispered secrets and rhythms only she seemed to understand. She didn't tour. She didn't chase stages. Instead, she traveled like a wind choosing its own direction, from small towns to metropolises, from chapels to community centers, leaving fragments of music like footprints in the sand. She was never alone. Word spread before her arrival. People didn't come just to hear her play. They came to hear her listen. Sometimes, she didn't even play. Sometimes, Livia invited others to sit at the piano with her. Children, elders, those afraid to touch the keys. She guided their hands gently, and together they created something no one had written before. She called it shared sound. It wasn't about being perfect. It was about being heard. In one such session, a boy with a stutter sat trembling beside her, afraid to touch the keys. "I'll mess it up," he whispered. She smiled. "There's nothing here to mess up, only to reveal." He played one note, then another. By the end of that afternoon, he composed a 4-bar melody that would later be featured in a youth mental health campaign. When asked later why he thought Livia chose him, he said simply, "She saw me without ever seeing me." Letters arrived by the hundreds, from mothers, former musicians, inmates, teachers. Many ended with the same phrase, "You reminded me I'm still music." Livia never responded with words. She responded with compositions, each handwritten, built from a line in the letter. Each sent quietly. A mother who lost a child to cancer received a piece called "The Breath You Left." An ex-convict who found solace in rhythm received "Forgiven Time." A man with dementia who no longer remembered his wife's name received "From the Forgotten Heart." She kept no records of these pieces, no copies. They belonged only to the people who wrote to her. Livia believed music was a gift, not a transaction. And yet she refused interviews, awards, TV shows, spotlights. But her absence only made her presence more mythic. The Artisan Awards ceremony was approaching. It would be held at the Royal Hall in New York. A room carved in gold and ghostly light, echoing the footsteps of centuries of greats. It would be broadcast to 94 countries. A marble podium, flanked by velvet flags, awaited center stage. Livia's reserved seat remained respectfully empty for nearly the entire evening, until minutes before the final presentation. The back doors creaked. She entered, not with an entourage, not with security, just with Edward. A violin case in one hand, her cane in the other. She didn't walk straight to the stage. She sat among the audience. When her name was called, the applause rose like a wave. She stood slowly and bowed, not to accept the award, but to honor the people in the room who had lived in silence, fought gently, and never been heard. Then she spoke into the microphone. "I don't have a speech," she said, "but I brought a voice." She opened the violin case and pulled out a simple wooden flute. It had belonged to her mother. As she brought it to her lips, the room held its breath. And then she played a melody without ego, without polish, just breath, just truth. And in that truth, the world was silenced again. The first note rose like mist, soft, delicate, ancient. It curled into the rafters of the Royal Hall, finding corners even the chandeliers had forgotten. The audience froze, not out of reverence, but something holier. Recognition. It wasn't just a song. It was an arrival. The sound of something unearthed, a whisper from the edge of the soul. Livia stood alone, the flute steady in her hands, eyes closed, not from blindness, but devotion. Each breath she gave the instrument carried stories words could never hold. She played not as a performer, but as a witness, someone who had stayed silent for years and finally found the breath to speak. The melody was simple but wandered. A question that answered itself. A longing stretched into sound. People forgot to blink to breathe. Some cried without realizing. Others held the hands of strangers. The piece lasted just under 5 minutes. When it ended, she lowered the flute slowly, as if unwilling to disturb the silence she'd created. She tilted her head and left the stage. No speech, no statement, not even a glance at the award, still gleaming untouched on its velvet pedestal. It didn't matter. The room rose around her, a standing ovation born not of protocol but of something wordless and primal. Even the most cynical critics didn't dare open their mouths. For once, the silence was enough. Outside, the night hung heavy and blue, like a velvet curtain draped over the city. Livia walked with Professor Edward down a narrow cobblestone street, lit only by occasional gas lamps. Her cane clicked softly with each step, echoing off the old stone buildings that had heard centuries of secrets. "They asked again if you'll accept the award," Edward said gently. Livia tilted her head. "Does music need a medal to matter?" He smiled. "No, but sometimes the world needs a mirror to see what it's become." She didn't reply. Instead, she turned toward a low wrought iron fence, beyond which lay a small park. Bare trees silhouetted against the moonlight. A lone bench beneath an arch of ivy. "Can we sit?" Livia asked. They sat. She placed the flute in her lap and lifted her face to the night. "I played that music for her," she said at last. Edward knew who she meant. He didn't interrupt. "I remember her hum more than her words. She'd sing while folding clothes or braiding my hair. Little half-melodies that never resolved. I never knew their names. I don't think they had names." He listened. "I thought I lost her when I lost my sight, that the colors faded first, then her voice." She turned slightly, hands folded over the flute. "But maybe I was just waiting for the right silence, the one where I could hear her again." Edward rested his hand on hers. "You gave her a second life tonight." They sat like that for a long time, the cold brushing their cheeks like a memory. The next morning, Livia's performance made headlines worldwide. But this time, the stories didn't focus on her blindness, the tragedy of her childhood, or the accolades. They focused on something else, a stillness, a reminder. One headline read, "She played for 5 minutes. The world stopped for 10. Another, "The note that taught us to listen again." And another, "No lights, no fireworks, just breath, just truth." She didn't accept the Artisan Award, but the foundation that granted it made an unprecedented decision. They renamed the award itself. Henceforth, it would be called the Livia Jackson Honor. Not as a prize, but as a promise. A promise to hear what the world had once refused to listen to. Months passed. Livia vanished from the public eye again, returning to a rhythm of quiet villages, handwritten compositions, and gentle moments of teaching. She never posted, never announced, but she was never forgotten. One winter morning in a small mountain town in the Catskills, she was found in the community library teaching a 7-year-old autistic boy to feel music through the vibrations in his feet. She lined up brass bowls filled with sand, taught him to tap them softly, then press his soles to the wooden floor and wait. He didn't speak, but when she played beside him, he smiled. Later, he took her hand and tapped his own melody into her palm. She played it back instantly. He laughed, and it was the first time in months his mother had heard him laugh. Livia never mentioned it, but a teacher from that town wrote about it in a blog post that quietly went viral. The title read, "She never told us who she was, but she left a music that made the snow feel warmer." In places she never visited, murals appeared, not of her face, but of her hands. Outstretched, playing invisible notes on the walls of schools, subway stations, refugee tents. People began using her compositions to process grief, celebrate healing, fill silences where words failed. Slowly, a new phrase emerged in the lexicon of music education. Play like Livia. It didn't mean perfection. It meant presence. It meant truth. It meant listening so deeply that music wasn't something you played. It was something you remembered. Back at Brookhaven Conservatory, a new wing was under construction. Glass walls, natural acoustics, accessible from every side. It would be called the Jackson Wing for sonic exploration. But the only words etched at the entrance would be hers. Silence is not the absence of sound. It is the presence of everything waiting to be heard. One day, years later, a young girl stepped into a quiet corner of a music library in San Francisco. She was blind, as Livia had been, and carried a recorder made from an old garden hose and a rusty flute mouthpiece. She wasn't famous. She wasn't known. But inside the cover of a Braille score in the archives, she found a piece of paper. It was a handwritten melody. No name, no date, just 7 notes. She played them and began to cry. Not because it was sad, but because someone, somewhere, had left a voice for her. And in that moment, she knew Livia had passed through, and the world still echoed with her breath. The sun hung low on the horizon, tinting the sea with an amber light that made the world seem hushed. In a time-worn coastal village in northern Maine, amid black cliffs and wind-stirred grasses, Livia sat in the back room of a local cafe, her hands resting on the edge of a piano older than the cafe itself. The keys stuck in places. Some were yellowed, others chipped, but it sang. And that, she once said, was enough. A dozen people gathered around. No cameras, no announcements. They came not for who she was, but for what they'd heard. A fisherman's daughter said she'd once heard a song that made her father cry for the first time since her mother's death. A woman who worked at the bakery across the street brought warm bread, not as payment, but as reverence. The door stayed open. Cold air drifted in and out with the tides. Livia didn't introduce herself. She asked each person what sound reminded them of home. Some said the crackle of firewood. Others, the hum of old refrigerators. One man smiled and said the silence of snow before it falls. She nodded and, without saying more, played. She took their sounds and gave them shape. She built music from memory, not hers, but theirs. She folded the notes to carry their weight. Her left hand marked a pattern like the pulse of a hearth. Her right, a rippling echo like snow melting on zinc roofs. The people didn't applaud, they breathed. After the final note faded, she reached for the bread with both hands, her smile quiet and complete. And the locals would tell the story for years. Not about a famous pianist, but about a girl who came, asked about home, and turned their answers into sound. Meanwhile, in cities she'd never returned to, the legacy of her silence deepened. Universities began developing courses, not on composition, but on listening. Programs emerged for invisible musicians, those without formal training, who played on borrowed instruments, who used rhythm to survive, not to perform. In the Bronx, a subway violinist named Camille Turner was invited to speak at the World Music Symposium after citing Livia as the reason she recorded her first album. "I thought music had to be loud to matter," she told thousands. "But she showed me you can whisper and still move mountains." In San Francisco, a girl built a listening dome from broken wind chimes and rainwater pipes after hearing Livia's story. She called it a home for forgotten sounds. When asked if she'd ever met Livia, she shook her head and said, "No one meets her. You feel her." And deep in the Amazon, in a village untouched by modern orchestras but not by pain, an elder stretched vines over hollow logs and began teaching rhythm to children orphaned by conflict. He called the rhythm Jackson's Pulse. The world no longer echoed just her name. It was reshaping itself around her silence. Still, Livia remained oblivious to most of it. She carried no phone. She didn't read the articles. She didn't track her influence like a shadow. She followed the music and let the rest follow her. In late fall, she traveled to Santa Fe, staying at a monastery that echoed with bells and the rustle of bamboo. The monks said she arrived during the gentlest rain they'd ever heard. She didn't ask for shelter, only a quiet place to hear her own thoughts. Each day, She walked the temple gardens barefoot, leaves gathering between her toes, gravel crunching under each step like memory. At night, she played for the monks, not with flourish, but with reverence. She used the sound of wind through paper walls, the drip of water in stone basins, the creak of century-old floorboards, and turned them into symphonies of stillness. A monk, nearly blind like her, wept as she played. "I never believed I'd hear someone speak the language of my dreams," he whispered. They gave her a small bell as a gift when she left. It barely made a sound, just a faint shimmer when moved, like a ghost brushing wind chimes. She wore it on her wrist from then on. Back at Brookhaven Conservatory, everything had changed beyond recognition. Once a symbol of silent elitism, it was now a sanctuary of rediscovery. A new generation of students arrived, not to compete, but to create, not to perform, but to tell the truth. A freshman named Elijah Carter, once mute from trauma, now composed for the entire student orchestra. A girl who grew up without books taught advanced rhythm using only her feet. The motto hung above the grand staircase. "Music is not what we play, it is what we allow ourselves to feel." In a display case near the entrance, untouched, gleamed the flute Livia had played on the night of the Artisan Award, donated anonymously with a note. "Let someone else take the voice for a while." One spring morning, years after that night in New York, Livia returned to the city, not for a concert, but for a child. A 6-year-old girl named Luma Hayes, blind from birth, diagnosed with an auditory disorder that made traditional music unbearable. Too loud, too shrill, too violent. Her parents wrote to every music therapist they could find. Most said the same thing. Maybe music isn't for her. But one therapist, old and quiet, said, "There's someone who might know how to help. She doesn't answer phones. She doesn't live anywhere. But if you write her story in music, she might come." So they wrote. A melody, just 4 notes, sent by mail. And one morning, Livia arrived. She didn't knock on the door. She sat on the steps outside, flute in hand, and began to play, not outward, but inward, into the cracks of the stone, into the breath of the house, into the silence where Luma was, curled up in her room, hands over her ears. Slowly, Luma lowered her hands, stepped out, 1 foot at a time, and sat beside the woman who didn't speak, didn't explain, just played. A melody crafted for Luma, shaped by her, designed not to overwhelm but to embrace. Luma cried, then touched the flute, then laughed, and a new song was born, one only the two of them would understand. Years later, when Luma became a sound artist known for creating immersive musical gardens, she would say, "I never learned to love music. I learned that music already loved me. She taught me that." And still, Livia moved quietly through the world, seeking no monuments, chasing no legacy, but leaving footprints of sound so soft they were only noticed if you listened with your soul. And those who truly listened, who really listened, began to notice the places she'd passed through, like fingerprints pressed into the wind. A library in Peru, where no book held words, only tones. A bridge in California that sang when crossed barefoot. A music box in a Ghanaian orphanage that played different songs depending on who opened it. She was never there for the unveiling, but the music always knew. It always carried her breath, her touch, her truth. And so, the girl who was mocked by a famous pianist, who was told she'd never play a Steinway, who would never perform for a real audience, didn't just silence the world, she taught it to listen. The wind moved gently through the desert's emptiness, brushing the cracked earth like the whisper of a forgotten name. Somewhere far from cities, in a land of red sand and distant horizons, Livia sat under an open sky, her back against a sun-warmed stone. No stage, no audience, just a silence as vast and wide as the stars about to emerge. She had come without telling anyone. No train schedule, no festival invitation, just a letter received months earlier. A letter written by a Navajo boy, his words carved on the back of a broken drumhead. It said, "There's a sound here we've forgotten how to hear. Can you help us remember?" She carried no instrument, only the bell on her wrist and the shape of his words echoing within her. At dusk, the village gathered. They came barefoot, wrapped in woven shawls, guided by grandparents who once sang lullabies to the wind. There were no chairs, no microphone, just the crackle of a small fire and the silence of expectation waiting to become music. Livia rose slowly and faced them, not by sight, but by sound. She could hear the difference in each person's breath, who shifted, who stayed still. She could hear the nervous tap of the boy who wrote to her, his heart stuttering like a lost beat. She knelt and pressed her palms to the ground. The people waited. She didn't speak. Instead, she began to hum, a low, steady tone. No words, no melody, just breath. Then, one by one, others joined. An elder tapped softly with a carved stick. A girl rattled a necklace of shells. Someone began striking 2 stones, slowly at first, then faster. The desert, ancient and vast, seemed to listen too. And in that moment, the people remembered. They remembered that music didn't come from radios, polished halls, or written scores. It came from them. From stories carried in their bones. From the pain in their ancestors' silence, the laughter shared beside dying fires, the rhythm of walking the same earth generation after generation. Livia had come to give them music. But in truth, she'd only come to remind them they already had it. When the night ended, the boy approached. He held the broken drumhead with both hands, trembling slightly. "It doesn't make sound anymore," he said. She took it gently and traced its edges with her fingers. "Then maybe it remembers silence better than any of us." He looked at her, eyes wide. "Can I learn to make it sing again?" She nodded, smiling, not with sound, but with story. And she left him with the only word he needed. Begin. The next day, she was gone. No goodbyes, just echoes. As the years passed, Livia's name became less a name and more a feeling. In academic journals, her influence was studied not for her compositions, but for their ripple effect. Music therapists called it the Jackson Shift, a movement from perfection to presence, a way of playing that put emotion before execution. In war zones, aid workers used her melodies to reach children who'd forgotten how to speak. In nursing homes, memory care specialists found that even patients with deep dementia recognized her songs, tapping their fingertips as if the music had always been part of them, waiting in some silent room of the mind. In courtrooms, her story was used as a case study in disability rights advocacy, showing the power of opportunity versus exclusion. A lawyer famously quoted her in a civil rights hearing. "You don't need to see to be a mirror. You just need to reflect the truth." But Livia never returned to those conversations. She didn't read the articles. She didn't participate in documentaries. When an international committee tried to grant her an honor for her journey, she declined with a note written in faint ink on handmade paper. "A whole life doesn't mean an end. I'm still listening." She wandered from country to country, appearing sometimes in the most unexpected places. A remote monastery in Colorado, a vineyard in southern Oregon, a rooftop in Detroit, where she played a lullaby for a street child's birthday. She never stayed longer than the music. But the world began to feel her presence before she arrived. Not through advertisements, but by coincidence. Suddenly, a forgotten piano was tuned. A classroom fell silent. A choir of strangers gathered without plan, as if drawn by a sound they didn't hear clearly but had always known. One winter in Seattle, on the coldest night of the year, a woman in her 90s sat alone in a public square beside a frozen fountain. She held a photograph of her brother, lost decades earlier in the war. She hadn't spoken in days. Then a girl with dark braids and a flute passed by and sat beside her. She played a melody made of snowflakes and ashes. And the old woman began to hum. She spoke her brother's name. And for the first time in 60 years she smiled. No one recorded it. No one posted it, but someone told someone else. And that's how the story grew. Not in headlines, but in hearts. Back in Chicago, Professor Edward, now old and silver-haired, sat by the lake near the Brookhaven Conservatory Gardens, reading a letter from a child in Oakland who'd built a violin from scrap wood and used his knees to hold it, having no arms. He wrote, "I heard her once on a tape someone left behind. I don't remember the melody. I remember the way it made me stop crying." Edward looked out at the water, the wind lifting the edge of his coat. He whispered aloud, "She's everywhere, isn't she?" The trees said nothing, but the breeze answered. Some say Livia returned to the hall in Los Angeles once, decades after her first gala, not to perform, but to listen. She sat in the farthest seat in the balcony, her hair now gray, the bell on her wrist worn by time. On stage, a 7-year-old girl, blind, from Haiti, took the bench. And when she played, Livia tilted her head slightly and smiled. The girl didn't know who watched her, but later found a folded note on the piano's lid. It read, "You heard the world, and the world heard you." And that was all. Years later, when people try to remember the woman named Livia Jackson, some will say she was the greatest pianist of her time. Others will say she was a teacher, a healer, a ghost who turned silence into song. But those who truly listened will say she was a bridge. A bridge between the seen and the unseen, the heard and the silenced, the wounded and the wondrous. And when her name is spoken, it won't be shouted. It will be whispered, like the first note of a melody yet to be written. The sea sang to her in tongues only her heart understood. Somewhere on the jagged cliffs of Oregon's coast, Livia sat at the border of land and water, the Pacific breathing against the stone in long, melancholic sighs. She had been there for days, perhaps weeks. Time didn't matter anymore. She kept no calendars, counted no days to performances. Her rhythms now were the tides, the wind, the echo of footsteps on soft sand. A small wooden recorder lay beside her. Not a grand flute, not an instrument of fame, just a modest thing hand-carved, left by a child in New Mexico, marked with uneven grooves and a tiny heart scratched near the mouthpiece. It made a thin, fragile, imperfect sound. She loved it. Her fingers traced its body like a prayer, not because she was about to play, but because she wasn't ready yet. Not until the story was ready to be told. Behind her, a boy approached. Maybe 12, freckles on his cheeks, a fishing line slung over his shoulder. He didn't speak right away. She heard his hesitation, the shift of weight, the nervous breath through his nose. "I thought you weren't real," he said at last. She smiled, her eyes still on the sea. "Neither did I." He took a step and sat beside her, careful and quiet. "You don't look like a legend." She laughed softly. "That's the secret. Legends are just people who waited long enough to become myths." He was silent for a while, thinking. "My dad died last year. He used to play guitar. Not fancy, just old folk songs. I hated it. Thought it was boring." Livia said nothing. "But after he died, I missed it more than anything. Not the songs, just the sound, even the out-of-tune parts." He looked down, rubbing a seashell between his fingers. "Now when I try to play," he whispered, "it just hurts." She turned to him, her face calm as twilight. "That's when it means something." He looked at her, confused. "If it hurts," she said, "it means the music still remembers." She offered the recorder. He hesitated. "I don't know how." "No one does," she said, "until." He took it, his hands trembling, and blew gently. A squeak, then a hoarse hum, then a note, broken and thin. But there. She didn't correct him. She smiled, placed her hand on the rock between them, and whispered, "He'd be proud of that note." The boy didn't speak, but he kept playing, and the sun dipped low. In other places, in far grander halls, the world still spoke her name. The UN named her a cultural envoy without ever hearing her accept the title. Education systems cited her in curriculum guides. Journalists called her the singular architect of a generation. Conservatories installed tactile music labs in her honor. But Livia never responded. Not out of aloofness, but because she was present in the places no one else bothered to look. A refugee camp in Tijuana, where she played lullabies through the walls of nylon tents. A hospital in Sao Paulo, where she composed a 3-note motif for each child who left this world, so their mothers could hum them back into memory. An alley in Los Angeles, where she left scores pinned to telephone poles with notes that read, "Play this and pass it on." She wasn't touring. She was tracing the world with sound, and people began to follow, not to watch, but to carry on. She sparked something deeper than performance, an unspoken movement. In France, they called it Écoute Libre, free listening. In Kenya, Nyimbo za Moyo, songs of the heart. In Canada, simply the Livia way. Thousands of nameless musicians began performing in places where no one expected music. Nursing homes, stairwells, long-distance buses, abandoned churches. They played not for applause, but for connection. They wore no uniforms, held no microphones. Their only shared mark was a small circle drawn in chalk, string, or ink, signifying an ear, always listening. No central organization, no leader, just music whispered from soul to soul. And through it all, Livia remained a wanderer. She carried nothing but the wind and a notebook of braille-stamped pages, filled not with letters, but with sensations. The smell of oranges in a New Orleans market, pigeons strutting on a rooftop, gravel under a child's ballet slippers. Each entry was a beginning, each note a fragment of some unwritten, unfinished symphony of the world. One early morning in Portland, she passed a man crying in a park. He didn't look up. She didn't speak. She just sat on the bench beside him and began tapping a slow rhythm against the wooden slats. 4 beats, pause, 4 beats, pause. Eventually, he tapped back. 3 beats, then silence, then 4. She adjusted, followed his pattern. And so, the two composed a silent duet in a city just waking. 2 strangers who would never know each other's names. But something between them broke and then mended in the rhythm. When he stood to leave, he left a flower beside her. She didn't look up, but she felt its fragrance and kept tapping. Stories like these began to spread in a way no PR campaign ever could. Not because they were printed, but because they were lived. If you asked 10 people where they last heard Livia Jackson, you'd get 10 different cities, 10 different sounds. In Miami, she played spoons on a food stall counter. In Chicago, she taught blind children to map notes with their feet. In Alaska, she played for glaciers that answered with their cracks. Each place changed her, and each place she changed in return. But she never took credit. She only listened, played, and left. As the years passed, her hair silvered, her steps slowed, but her presence grew brighter, like the last glow of embers before dawn. And then, one day, she stopped. Not suddenly, not dramatically. She simply sat in a garden in a Taos village, set her cane aside, and said to a little girl following her with curious, wide eyes, "Now it's your turn." The girl asked. "To do what?" "To listen." And when the girl asked what she should listen for, Livia placed her hand on the child's chest and whispered, "Start here." That night, Livia played her final piece. No audience, no cameras, just the wind, the crickets, and a river winding through the trees. It wasn't grand, wasn't loud. It was the sound of a life coming to peace. And when the sun rose, she was gone. She wasn't mourned, but remembered in breaths, in stillness, in every place where music once waited for permission and now flowed freely. The woman who was ridiculed for daring to touch a piano. The girl who played without sight but saw what no one else could. The soul who turned silence into a sanctuary didn't just change the world. She retuned it, and it still sings in her key. The piano stood untouched in the corner of the orphanage's common room. Its frame, once polished, now dulled by years of small fingers and sun-faded memories. No one played it anymore. The tuning was off, and some black keys stuck, refusing to rise after being pressed. The children used it more as a hiding spot than a home for music. Until one day, a stranger walked in, wearing dust-worn shoes, a linen shawl over her shoulders, and a single silver bell on her wrist. At first, she said nothing, just rested her hand gently on the piano's lid and smiled. The children watched from a distance, eyes wide and skeptical. But when she slid onto the bench, her presence drew them in like the slow unfolding of morning. Her fingers didn't strike the keys. They hovered, waited, listened, and then, without ceremony or flourish, she played. The melody was soft, unknown to all, yet familiar to all. It had no name. It wasn't bold or striking. It was simply kind, like the first hand you held, like the murmur of a lullaby you didn't remember until now. The children drew closer. Some sat cross-legged on the tiled floor. Others leaned against door frames. She never asked their names. She didn't need to. She had always known how to listen before speaking. This would be the last recorded sighting of Olivia Jackson. No passports, no tickets, no destination, just music left behind like footprints in water. No announcement followed. No memorial service, no obituary. Just a silence that fell over the world like snow. And in that silence came echoes, not of her name, but of her voice. Because her music was still everywhere. In hospital waiting rooms, where mothers held premature babies to their chests, and hummed lullabies based on the 5-note theme she once played for grief. In subway tunnels, where violinists began their sets not with Bach or Mozart, but with simple, improvised melodies. Music that didn't ask for applause, only presence. In classrooms, where blind students felt rhythm not through pages, but through movement and memory, because Olivia had shown the world that sound didn't need to be seen to be understood. In nursing homes, where therapists used vibrations and silence to soothe trembling hands. In cities, villages, and corners of the earth untouched by wealth but overflowing with spirit. People began to say her name not as a legend, but as a gesture. They whispered, "Livia, the way you whisper hope." A woman in Puerto Rico named her daughter after her. A monk in Colorado composed the chant using only the rhythms of breath, calling it the Jackson Canticle. In the streets of Harlem, a mural appeared, not of her face, but of a single ear surrounded by swirling colors, painted by children who knew her only through stories. The caption below read, "Listen deeper." At Brookhaven Conservatory, now utterly transformed, the Jackson Wing opened its doors to a new generation. It welcomed students with no formal training, no reading skills, no traditional language. It accepted applications sent through hums, taps, even silences. At the center of its atrium, there was no statue, only a grand piano surrounded by empty chairs. Visitors were encouraged not to watch, but to sit, to join, to remember that music was never meant to be distant. And on the wall behind the piano, carved in stone, were the final words she once whispered to a girl who didn't know where to begin. "If you can hear it, it already belongs to you." One day, a young student named Nora Evans, blind since birth, entered that space holding her mother's hand. She had never touched a piano before, never believed she could, but she had read a story about a girl who sat in hallways and listened through walls. She approached the keys slowly, traced them, trembled, and played a note. Just one. But the sound that followed didn't come from the piano. It came from every person who heard her. It came from within. And though Nora never knew it, she began her own story that day. Because that was what Olivia left the world. Not just a legacy, not just compositions, but permission. Permission to play without perfection. To listen without judgment, to create without apology, to exist in all the broken, beautiful, untrained mess of being human, and still call it music. In a distant canyon, where the wind still weaves through hollow stones, if you sit long enough, you might hear a soft echo. Not a voice, not a song, just a resonance, a presence, as if someone once sat there, played, listened, and left a silence that sings. That's where she is now. Not gone, but everywhere we choose to listen. And the next time you hear a child humming to themselves beneath the noise of the world, or an old man tapping a rhythm on his coffee cup when no one's looking, or notice you're breathing in time without knowing why, stop, be still, and remember the blind girl they mocked, who played a note and silenced the world. She never sought fame, never demanded recognition, never fought for a stage. Yet Olivia Jackson changed the world one silent note at a time. Mocked for her blindness, dismissed before she even touched the keys, she didn't just prove them wrong. She redefined what it meant to hear. Her legacy wasn't in the thunder of applause, but in the quiet places where music had been forgotten. And long after the lights dimmed and the critics fell silent, her melodies kept breathing through the children, through the silence, through every soul brave enough to listen. Because, in the end, she didn't play to impress the world. She played to awaken it.